carbon mass balance. If you understand carbon dioxide transport, this is really easy to understand. Because carbon dioxide transport is basically this reaction plus a whole bicarbonate buffer system on top of it. Which basically it's the same thing but just a little bit more complicated. So hopefully this makes sense to you. Well, does it make sense? Should I go over this again? Yeah? No? Maybe so, yes? Okay, what didn't make sense about this?
I just have a question. What are the aspiring cells again?
Respiring cells are basically any cell in your body that's doing any metabolic activity. So it could be neurons, it could be muscle cells, it could be glandular cells. Any cell is basically a respiring cell. So I could just say cells, really.
Okay.
I'm just saying cells that need oxygen, really. The cells that need oxygen, they generally have a low PO2 because they're consuming that oxygen, right? They're turning it into carbon dioxide. But what about this didn't make sense? Does the mass balance part not make sense? People are having a hard time with the mass balance? Speak up. I see some confused faces. Yes? Can I go over the carbon dioxide version? Or the buffer? How about I do that at the end of lecture? So that's it's a bigger topic than this. So I'll go over that at the end of the lecture. But what about the oxygen transport? Yes.
HB stands for
Hemoglobin.
Just a heme unit, or
Yeah, or you could yes, heme, heme or hemoglobin. It actually really doesn't matter because the explanation is still the same.
okay.
They're interchangeable essentially in this description. Everyone thinks this is fine?
Well, mass balance is basically, you're saying it's just like the same idea as concentration gradients or like a pressure gradient. It just goes to where
Yeah,
it's less of it.
as any chemical equilibrium, if there is a giant surplus of something or a giant like deficit of something, the equilibrium is going to shift to correct it, right? So there's a surplus of something like a reaction of, so you have the reaction of basically A going to B and back and forth. If you add a lot more A, you're going to drive the equation towards the B to kind of balance it out. If you draw down B, you'll still get a big direction moving forward to try to balance that equilibrium. This is why we call this mass balance. And so the same thing is happening here. I could rewrite A and B to be hemoglobin bounded to oxygen and just hemoglobin and unbounded oxygen, right? If this goes down, we're going to drive this reaction. Right? If this goes up, we're going to drive the opposite reaction, right? That is mass balance. Yeah, question over here. Well, that's just kind of part of the structure of heme. It's actually the part that helps attract the oxygen.
But it's not like
No. So we're treating the whole heme unit as one molecule called HB. Yeah. So we're just counting as one entity. We're not worried about all the protein around it. We're not worried about the iron group. We're all saying it's just HB, hemoglobin. Yeah.
So this wouldn't work if plasma had no solubility for oxygen, right?
That's difficult to say because then oxygen would just stay in your alveoli. It would never make it into your bloodstream because that's like running into a wall.
Okay.
If there's no solubility there, it just not gonna travel through it.
Okay.
So then you would have to
It
have.
wouldn't even get into the red blood cells stuff, right?
Well, the red blood cells are surrounded by plasma, right?
Right.
So yeah, it just wouldn't work. Yeah, what's up?
Is it just assumed that the partial pressure for the red blood cell is actually the same capillary pressure?
Mm-hmm.
And
During the perfusion stage, where oxygen diffuses into the blood, there is you're going to reach equilibrium where both the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood and the alveoli are both 100.
It's just like constantly flowing within the red blood cells and the capillaries back and forth. And then now, like once like that red blood cell reaches around those respiring cells, then like since the partial pressure of those other cells are lower, it just travels towards the other cells.
Yeah. It kind of creates a sink of oxygen where oxygen is being pulled to these cells, and as it's being pulled away from these cells, it drives the equilibrium equation to make up for that loss of oxygen, free oxygen molecules. Any other questions? Confusion? This is the time to speak up. I'm probably not going to go over this again, unless you come to office hours and ask me. I'll go over it then, but in class, it's probably last time. Yeah.
How much oxygen's in a hemoglobin?
For hemoglobin, it's about 4 molecules. Yeah, 1 for each heme group. You good? All right, cool. So let's get back to digestion. So we talked about the cephalic phase, basically food going through mouth, being chewed, being mixed with saliva, and then being swallowed and going down your esophagus via peristalsis. And so the end of the cephalic phase is basically when the content, the bolus, remember bolus is what we call food before it passes to the stomach. The bolus will then get into the stomach, and then we enter a new phase in digestion. We enter the gastric phase. Gastric phase is purely associated with just the stomach. So generally this is what happens in the gastric phase. This is all about short versus long reflexes. So you have the short reflex, where you're going to have some kind of short reflex stimulus. So this could be distension. What does distension mean again? Yeah, you're stretching something. Stomach gets stretched, esophagus gets stretched, some part gets stretched, that's distension, right? There could be this distension. We also have receptors that can detect polypeptides, and amino acids. We have chemical receptors. We also have mechanical receptors that detect stretch, and those can set off the input that goes into the enteric. What they call it the enteric plexus here, but you can just say this is basically the enteric nervous system. So those mechanical and chemical inputs then get processed by the enteric nervous system, and the enteric nervous system via some neurons will then tell target cells to do something. So to secrete something and do some motility, right? Push things around. And that is the short reflex. Now you can have the long reflex too. So I'm going to draw the long reflex in black. So you remember those anticipatory reactions? So if you see food, smell food, even hear food, hear the microwave going, your GI tract is going to get ready to go. It's going to start secreting stuff. It's going to, prepare to digest food. And so that's part of the long reflex. So we can have anticipatory reaction. And that's sent from the brain, from the medulla oblongata, and it interfaces with the enteric nervous system, which in turn will then target these cells to have them start secreting stuff, to have them, have the smooth muscles start contracting to create motility. And so we have both short and long reflexes occurring in the gastric phase. Remember that large chart we drew before where we were showing all the short reflexes and all the long reflexes, and that's very abstract. Well, this is what it looks like just for the gastric phase. And so here's the stomach. This is where pretty much whole gastric phase is occurring. Did I need to go back? Was everyone good on this back slide? People need to, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So the long, the difference between the long and the short is you have the anticipatory reaction.
All long reflexes are involve the central nervous system. So they involve some part of the brain and conductance down the spinal cord. And so the anticipatory reaction is handled by the brain. Remember, because you're smelling and hearing and seeing things, that's all handled by your brain, right? So that being dealt by the central nervous system, so then yes, it's a long reflex. That's the main difference between a short reflex and a long reflex. The long reflex involves the central nervous system. Are we good with this? Alright, moving on. So yeah, here's the stomach. So, let's try this. Stomach. And so stomach, even though it's just one kind of sac with two ends, right? Food comes into this direction, into the cardiac region, and comes out of the pyloric region. It acts as a dual function, right? So generally the top portion here is for storage. And then this bottom part is for digestion. And the stomach, actually, that's why we kind of have this enlarged stomach, because it's there for storage, right? Sometimes we eat huge meals. Sometimes you go to, go to Korean barbecue, or you go to soup plantation. That's the vegetarian-friendly version. And you just eat a massive amount of food. Actually, in fact, humans have been geared to overeat.